A single building once held the collected wisdom of the ancient world. This was the Library of Alexandria, and its disappearance remains one of our civilization's deepest wounds. By the end of this exploration, you will understand not just how it was lost, but precisely what knowledge vanished with it, and why that absence still echoes in our modern world. We will move past the simple story of a fire to uncover a secret history of slow decay and deliberate destruction. What revolutionary scientific ideas were silenced forever, and could their survival have changed the course of human progress? The stakes are the very foundations of our understanding. What do you believe is the greatest cost when a culture forgets its own past? The library was born from a conqueror's dream, but not of territory. After Alexander's empire fractured, his general Ptolemy took Egypt. He founded a new capital, Alexandria, and envisioned it as more than a seat of power. Ptolemy wanted to command the world of ideas. His project was the Mauseon, a temple to the muses that became the first true research institute. Scholars lived there, debated there, and were supported by the state to think, write, and compile. At its heart was the library, a repository with a breathtakingly simple mission: collect every book in the world. This was cultural soft power on an unprecedented scale. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers of an ancient Egyptian land, sought legitimacy through knowledge. They didn't just want Greek scrolls. Royal agents were dispatched to every port and market, authorized to buy or borrow texts from every known culture. Ships docking in Alexandria were searched not for contraband, but for books. Any scroll found was confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and a copy, not always the original, was returned to the owner. The goal was a universal archive, a single place containing the totality of human wisdom: Egyptian medical papyri, Persian astronomical charts, Hebrew scriptures, Indian philosophical treatises, and of course, the works of Greek poets and philosophers. Imagine the audacity. In an age of handwritten manuscripts and slow travel, they aimed for a complete compendium of thought. This wasn't merely hoarding. It was an attempt to synthesize, to compare, to find the underlying truths that connected all civilizations. For the first time, knowledge was seen not as the property of a single people, but as a human inheritance to be gathered and protected. This grand, fragile dream would define the library's purpose and ultimately its tragic vulnerability. This was not a quiet archive. The Library of Alexandria was a living, breathing engine of discovery. Think of it less as a museum for old scrolls and more as the world's first great research university, complete with state-funded salaries, communal dining halls, and endless debate. Scholars from across the known world were given a remarkable gift: the freedom to think, supported by the resources of a kingdom. Their mandate was not to preserve the past, but to interrogate it, to push the boundaries of what humanity understood. Within its halls, disciplines we now consider separate: astronomy, geography, medicine, poetry collided in a constant creative exchange. A mathematician might overhear a physician's problem and propose a new solution. A poet's work might inspire a philosopher's theory. This cross-pollination of ideas from Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and other traditions created an intellectual environment unlike any before it. Here, knowledge was not just stored, it was actively manufactured. The library provided the tools, the community, and the safety to ask dangerous questions. This collaborative ecosystem is what truly made Alexandria a beacon. It turned information into insight. So when we speak of the library's loss, we are not merely mourning a collection of texts. We are mourning the sudden silencing of that vibrant, humming conversation. We are mourning the end of an era where the state's greatest investment was in pure, speculative thought. The death of this institution meant the dissolution of a network, the scattering of a community, and the freezing of a scientific momentum that had been building for generations. The experiment stopped, the debates fell quiet, the questions for a very long time went unanswered. The ambition of the Ptolemies was matched only by the sheer logistical audacity of their methods. To fill the shelves of their universal library, they didn't just send out polite requests. They launched a state-sponsored campaign of intellectual acquisition, a systematic hunt for the world's written word. Royal agents operated with a simple, sweeping mandate. Any text that entered the city was considered a candidate for the collection. Historians note a famous royal decree concerning the bustling port of Alexandria. Every ship that docked from every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond was subject to a search, but officials weren't looking for spices or silks. They were searching for books. Any scrolls found on board were immediately confiscated and taken to the library. There, teams of scribes would work tirelessly to create a copy. In theory, the original was to be returned to its owner. In practice, many accounts suggest the library often kept the prized originals, sending the new copy back instead. This was knowledge collected not through invitation, but through a kind of bureaucratic osmosis, siphoning the intellectual wealth of every trading nation that passed through their harbor. This aggressive approach extended far beyond opportunistic seizures. The Ptolemies were also strategic borrowers in the most high-stakes sense. One legendary story involves the official Athenian state copies of the great Greek playwrights, the definitive versions of works by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The library administrators wanted these originals desperately. They asked to borrow them, offering an enormous sum of silver as a guarantee for their safe return. Athens, perhaps needing the funds, agreed. But once the precious scrolls were in Alexandria, the Ptolemies made a calculated decision. They forfeited the entire massive deposit. They kept the originals and sent meticulously made copies back to Athens. The message was clear. The financial loss was insignificant compared to the value of securing the authentic text for their collection. This wasn't theft in the shadowy sense. It was a transparent, almost brazen transaction, placing a monetary price on cultural heritage and deciding the knowledge itself was worth far more. This relentless quest created a repository of staggering diversity. Alongside the Greek classics sat Egyptian medical papyri detailing surgical procedures, Babylonian astronomical diaries tracking the planets, Phoenician maritime logs, and philosophical discourses from the East. It was a genuine, if forcibly assembled, crossroads of global thought. Yet this very success raises profound questions that echo into our own time. Where is the line between preservation and appropriation? The library's mission was to safeguard knowledge for humanity, a noble goal, but its methods often bypassed the consent of the cultures that produced that knowledge. It centralized intellectual power in one place under one royal dynasty. This massive operation of consolidation reflects an immense, almost sacred value placed on ideas themselves. But it also reminds us that the history of knowledge is inseparable from the history of power, of who gets to collect, to define, and to control the narrative of human achievement. The library became a mirror of the ancient world's complexity, a place of luminous scholarship built, in part, upon a foundation of uncompromising royal will. But a collection of this scale creates its own unique problem. How do you find anything with hundreds of thousands of scrolls, each a unique handwritten document on papyrus or parchment? The library risked becoming a tomb of knowledge rather than a treasury. A text could be physically present but intellectually lost, buried in a sea of unorganized information. The solution emerged from the mind of a scholar named Callimachus, a poet and librarian who understood that true power lies not in possession but in access. His monumental creation was called the Pinakes, a word meaning tables or lists. This was far more than a simple inventory. It was the ancient world's first true library classification system, a master key designed to unlock the entire collection. Callimachus and his team undertook a task of staggering complexity. They systematically reviewed the library's vast holdings, scroll by scroll. For each work, they recorded the author's name, the title, the opening lines, the total number of lines, and a brief summary of the subject matter. But they went much further. The Pinakes organized knowledge itself. It divided all texts into broad genres: epic poetry, tragedy, history, philosophy, medicine, law, and then listed authors alphabetically within each category. For each author, it included critical commentary and biographical notes, essentially creating the first scholarly bibliography. Imagine walking into that vast hall and, instead of facing chaos, consulting a master directory. You could look up all known works on medicine, find every play by Euripides, or discover every philosophical treatise that began with a specific argument. This transformed the library from a warehouse into a navigable universe of thought. The loss of the Pinakes is a separate, often overlooked catastrophe within the larger tragedy. When we think of the library's destruction, we mourn the scrolls, but we seldom consider the loss of the map. The Pinakes was the intellectual architecture of the ancient world's knowledge. It was a systematic, analytical approach to information science that would not be rivaled in scope or sophistication for over 1,000 years. Its disappearance meant that even if fragments of text survived elsewhere, the comprehensive, organized understanding of what existed, how it related to other works, and who wrote it was erased. We lost the context, the lineage of ideas. A single surviving scroll without the Pinakes is an orphan thought, its family and origins unknown. This foundational step in organizing human understanding, this grand experiment in making knowledge accessible and relational, vanished. And without that map, the true scale of what was in the library, and therefore what we have lost, becomes infinitely harder to measure. The silence left behind is not just the absence of voices, but the absence of the catalogue that told us how all those voices were meant to speak to one another. The library's first great disaster arrived not with a decree, but with a spark born of desperation. In the year 48 before the Common Era, the Roman civil war spilled onto the streets of Alexandria. Julius Caesar, pursuing his rival Pompey, found himself trapped within the city's walls, besieged by the forces of the Egyptian king Ptolemy XIII. The situation was dire. Caesar's fleet, docked in the harbor, was about to be seized by the enemy. His solution was brutally pragmatic. He ordered his men to set fire to his own ships, a tactical decision to deny their use to his opponents. But in a dense, ancient city built largely of wood and papyrus, fire was a living force with a mind of its own. The historian Plutarch, writing over a century later, describes how the flames leapt from the docks, driven by the wind, and surged into the city. They engulfed the warehouse district along the waterfront, and it was here, according to the accounts passed down, that a vast quantity of scrolls met their end. The Roman philosopher Seneca would later cite a staggering figure, claiming 400,000 volumes were lost. This image of priceless knowledge vanishing in a blaze meant for warships is seared into our collective memory. Yet the historical reality is more layered and in some ways more tragic. Most scholars now believe this fire did not destroy the main library complex itself, which was part of the royal palace grounds further inland. What burned was almost certainly a secondary storage facility, a kind of overflow warehouse near the port. These may have been duplicates, recent acquisitions awaiting cataloging, or commercial book shipments. But the scale of the loss, even of duplicates, was catastrophic. This event established a haunting pattern that would echo for millennia. The greatest threats to human heritage are rarely deliberate acts of censorship. More often, they are the unintended casualties of larger conflicts, the collateral damage of political ambition and military necessity. A general makes a split-second decision for tactical advantage, and centuries of accumulated thought turned to ash in the wind. The fire of 48 BCE was a warning, a stark demonstration of how fragile the threads of civilization truly are when caught in the crossfire of power. It revealed the library not as an untouchable sanctuary, but as a physical structure in a very real and dangerous world. While the heart of the institution survived this blow, its aura of invincibility was gone. The slow unraveling had begun. The story of a single cleansing fire is a powerful myth. It offers a clear villain, a dramatic moment, and a simple end. But history is rarely so neat. The truth of the library's disappearance is far more gradual and in many ways more unsettling. It was not a sudden murder, but a slow fading, a death by 1,000 cuts over several centuries. After Caesar's fire damaged the warehouse, the library as an institution limped on. It remained a symbol of prestige, but the golden age of the Ptolemies was over. Egypt was now a Roman province, its wealth flowing to Rome, not into the halls of Alexandrian scholarship. The first and most fatal cut was not violence, but indifference. Imagine a world-class research center today, its funding slowly stripped away year after year, fellowships disappear, new acquisitions halt, the brilliant minds no longer supported drift away to other cities, other patrons. The building itself might still stand, but the vibrant life within it withers. This is the slow-motion disaster that likely befell the great library. Political instability became routine in Roman Egypt. The city was a tinderbox of social and religious tensions, frequently erupting in street conflicts between different communities. During these periods of unrest, the palace quarter, where the main library was housed, could have been damaged or looted. Each incident would have chipped away at the collection, scattered the scholars, and degraded the physical structure. There was no single decree to destroy it, just a creeping erosion of the conditions that allowed it to thrive. The priorities of the empire shifted. Knowledge for its own sake became a lesser concern than administrative control and economic extraction. The great engine of state-funded inquiry simply ran out of fuel. This perspective changes everything. It means the loss was not a clean break, but a fraying. Scrolls didn't vanish in one apocalyptic blaze. They were lost one by one to decay in neglected storage, to reuse as scrap paper or packing material, to being sold off by underpaid custodians, or to simple disintegration from age and poor conditions. The knowledge died with a whisper, not a scream. This slow attrition is perhaps the greatest warning the library's story offers us. It shows that civilization's treasures are not only vulnerable to spectacular acts of destruction, but to the quiet, grinding forces of neglect and shifting values. A society can lose its memory not because it chooses to burn its books, but because it simply stops caring for them, stops reading them, stops believing they are worth the cost of preservation. The fire makes for a better story, but the slow fade is the one we should fear most, for it is the disaster that happens almost without anyone noticing, until one day you look up and realize the light has gone out. Yet the slow fade of indifference was not the only force at work. A new and far more decisive threat was gathering strength, one driven not by apathy, but by profound conviction. By the late 4th century of the Common Era, the Roman world had transformed. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, was now the official religion of the empire. Under Emperor Theodosius I, a series of sweeping decrees outlawed pagan rituals and ordered the closing of their temples. This was more than a change in policy, it was a revolution in thought. The goal was a unified Christian empire, and the old gods, along with the knowledge and traditions surrounding them, were now seen as a dangerous obstacle to that unity. In this charged atmosphere, the city of Alexandria, always a crucible of ideas, became a battleground for the soul of the empire. Here stood the Serapeum, a magnificent temple to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. This was no ordinary shrine. For centuries, it had functioned as a vital intellectual annex, often described as a daughter library to the Great Collection. Many scholars believe that as the main library complex declined, priceless scrolls were moved for safekeeping into the Serapeum storerooms. It was a fortress of classical learning, a last redoubt for pagan philosophy and science in a rapidly changing world. In the year 391, that redoubt fell. Following public tensions and with the support of the imperial decrees, the city's Christian patriarch, Theophilus, led a mobilized crowd against the temple. The event was less a battle and more a systematic dismantling. The great statue of Serapis was pulled down and shattered. The temple itself was methodically taken apart, stone by stone, and a Christian church was erected on its foundations. But what of the texts? Historical accounts are chillingly sparse on this detail, focusing on the religious triumph. The fate of the scrolls housed within is not described with any certainty. Some may have been looted, some burned, some simply scattered and lost. The silence in the record is itself a kind of answer. The knowledge they contained works of Neoplatonic philosophy, treatises on ancient Egyptian rites, scientific theories rooted in a pre-Christian worldview was not deemed worthy of preservation by the new authorities. Its value had been erased by dogma. This moment represents a catastrophic shift. It was a loss driven not by accident or neglect, but by active ideological rejection. Certain branches of human understanding were now declared incompatible with truth and were therefore targeted for eradication. The destruction of the Serapeum was a physical act with a philosophical purpose, to sever the present from a pagan past. It marked the point where theology and classical learning were set on a collision course, and one sought to supplant the other entirely. The vibrant, questioning spirit of the Mausian, which had welcomed all ideas into debate, was now anathema to an age seeking a single, unified creed. A door in the mansion of human thought was not just closed, it was sealed and the room behind it forgotten. What echoes of that ancient, pluralistic conversation were finally silenced in the dust of the Serapeum? We can only guess, and the guessing itself is a monument to our loss. The most enduring legend of the library's end is also almost certainly a lie. Centuries after the last scroll turned to dust, a dramatic story emerged to fill the silence. It claims that in the year 642, Arab armies under the Caliph Omar conquered Alexandria. The general, so the tale goes, asked what should be done with the great library's contents. He was told the books either contradicted the Quran, in which case they were heresy, or they agreed with it, in which case they were superfluous. His reported decree was chillingly utilitarian. He ordered the scrolls to be used as fuel to heat the city's bathhouses, a supply so vast it supposedly lasted for 6 months. This narrative is powerful, visceral, and perfectly villainous. It provides a clear culprit, a definitive moment, and a shocking image of knowledge literally going up in steam. It has been repeated for generations as historical fact. But when we trace this story back to its source, the trail doesn't lead to the 7th century. It leads to a Syrian bishop and historian named Bar-Hebrius, writing in the 13th century, over 600 years after the supposed event. His account is the earliest known version of this specific bathhouse story. Crucially, it is absent from all contemporary Arab histories of the conquest. The detailed chronicles written by early Muslim scholars, who meticulously recorded the events and decisions of the caliphs, make no mention of this monumental act of destruction. If such an order had been given, it would have been a major event noted by both sides. Its complete silence in the primary records is deafening. Modern scholarship now widely views this legend as a later fabrication, a piece of anti-Islamic propaganda born during the era of the Crusades. At a time of intense religious and military conflict between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, the story served a potent political purpose. It painted the Muslim conquerors not just as military adversaries, but as barbaric destroyers of the classical heritage that medieval Christendom was beginning to reclaim for itself. The library, a symbol of enlightened pagan and early Christian scholarship, became a perfect martyr in this ideological war. Its destruction was retroactively weaponized to frame one civilization as the guardian of knowledge and the other as its mortal enemy. This revelation is not about exonerating one side or another. It is about understanding how history itself becomes a battlefield. The true fate of any remaining texts in 7th century Alexandria is far less cinematic. By that time, after centuries of decay, conflict, and ideological purges, the Great Library as an institution had long ceased to function. Any surviving scrolls would have been scattered, hidden in private collections, or stored in other, diminished institutions. The Arab conquest may have been the final chapter in the city's long transformation, but it was not the dramatic bonfire of legend. The real tragedy of this myth is that it obscures a far more complex and cautionary truth. It shows us that the loss of knowledge is often followed by a second loss, the corruption of memory. When we cannot bear the ambiguity of a slow fade, we invent a decisive fire. When we need a villain for our historical narratives, we provide one, even centuries after the fact. The library's story became a canvas upon which later generations projected their own conflicts, their own fears, and their own need for a simple, moralistic tale. In doing so, they entangled the legacy of a place dedicated to truth in a web of enduring historical fiction. So what exactly went up in smoke, or crumbled into dust, or was torn apart for kindling? To measure the true scale of the loss, we must try to walk those silent halls in our minds, to glimpse the titles on the scrolls that are no longer there. We know the library held the great Greek works, the plays of Sophocles, the philosophy of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid. Many of these survived elsewhere, copied and recopied. The deeper tragedy lies in the other sections, the texts from civilizations whose own records did not endure. Think of the complete histories of the Phoenicians, the master sailors and traders who connected the Mediterranean. Their own accounts of founding Carthage, of navigating by the stars to distant shores like Britain, are almost entirely gone. We rely on the descriptions written by their rivals, the Greeks and Romans. It is like trying to understand a person's life story only through the words of their enemies. The library likely held their original chronicles, written on papyrus or leather. With them, we lost the Phoenician perspective on their own remarkable world. Then there were the Babylonians and Chaldeans, the ancient astronomers of Mesopotamia. They tracked the movements of planets over centuries, recording their observations on clay tablets. The library's scribes would have copied these onto more portable scrolls, creating a centralized archive of celestial data spanning over 1,000 years. These were not just lists of stars, they were sophisticated mathematical models predicting lunar eclipses and planetary positions with astonishing accuracy. The loss of these compiled records set astronomy back. Later scholars, like the Greeks, had to relearn through observation what had already been discovered and documented. We are left with fragments, while the great corpus of their knowledge, a scientific legacy built generation by generation, vanished. Perhaps the most poignant losses are in medicine. Ancient Egypt had a renowned medical tradition. The famous Ebers papyrus, which survives today, is just one text. The library at Alexandria would have gathered dozens, perhaps hundreds, of such treatises. These scrolls detailed diagnoses, herbal remedies, and surgical procedures for everything from setting broken bones to possibly even early forms of cataract surgery. They represented millennia of practical experimentation. When this collected wisdom was lost, countless techniques and understandings of anatomy and healing simply faded from memory. European medicine centuries later would have to painfully rediscover much of this knowledge, a delay that undoubtedly affected the well-being of millions. And what of the voices from philosophy's dawn? Thinkers like Heraclitus, who said you cannot step into the same river twice, or Democritus, who theorized that all matter was made of tiny, indivisible atoms. We know their revolutionary ideas only through brief quotes and critiques written by later philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who often disagreed with them. Their original, full works, the books where they laid out their arguments in their own words, were almost certainly in the library. Without them, we see the pre-Socratic world through a distorted lens, filtered by the very thinkers who sought to supersede them. We have the echoes of their ideas, but the original, powerful voice is gone. This is the ultimate cost. The Library of Alexandria was a global collection. It did not center one civilization over another. It sought to place the wisdom of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Phoenician coast, and the Greek islands all on an equal shelf. Its destruction did more than burn paper. It shattered the only existing mirror that reflected the full intellectual diversity of the ancient world. In its absence, our view of history became unavoidably fragmented and disproportionately focused on the Greco-Roman narrative that later Europe preserved. We are left with a partial map of human thought, with entire continents of knowledge sunk beneath a silent sea. The question that haunts us is not just what we lost, but how different our understanding of humanity's journey would be if that mirror had remained unbroken. The silence left by those vanished scrolls becomes deafening when we focus on a single, staggering statistic from the golden age of Greek theater. The three titans of tragedy, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, collectively wrote nearly 300 plays. What we possess today is a heartbreakingly thin sliver of that legacy. Only 7 plays by Aeschylus survive, 7 by Sophocles, 18 by Euripides. These numbers are not a measure of what was written, but of what was lost. For Aeschylus, we have perhaps 1/10 of his life's work. For Sophocles, the fraction is even smaller. The library at Alexandria almost certainly held the master copies, the authorized editions used for performances and study across the Greek-speaking world. Their disappearance did not just erase stories, it collapsed an entire dimension of human creativity. Think of each lost play not as a missing book, but as a vanished world. We know the titles of many plays about the myth of Pentheus, the saga of the Trojan War's aftermath, philosophical explorations of justice and fate that went far beyond the narratives we now consider classics. Each was a unique experiment in narrative structure, character psychology, and poetic language. With them, we have lost entire genres of tragedy that these playwrights pioneered and perfected. The surviving plays are masterpieces, but they are also a curated sample, a collection that survived by chance and the tastes of later copyists. What artistic revolutions, what radical ideas about gods and mortals, what breathtaking innovations in staging and chorus perished with the rest. The loss represents an aesthetic amnesia. We are left admiring the surviving pillars of a temple, forced to guess at the grandeur of the full structure that once stood around them. The impoverishment is profound. Our understanding of Greek thought, of how they processed suffering, destiny, and the human condition, is based on a fragmentary record. We hear a powerful but isolated echo where there was once a magnificent symphony. This specific loss reminds us that history is not just written by the victors. It is curated by the survivors. What remains of any culture's artistic output is often a mere shadow, a silhouette cast by the flickering light of what managed to endure the relentless passage of time and indifference. The loss of those plays is a cultural tragedy, but the silencing of the library's scientists may have altered the very course of human progress. Within its walls, thinkers proposed ideas so revolutionary they would not find mainstream acceptance for over 1,000 years. Their original manuscripts, the foundational texts of a potential early scientific revolution, were housed, studied, and debated in Alexandria, and then they were gone. Take the case of Aristarchus of Samos. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, while his contemporaries placed the Earth at the center of the cosmos, Aristarchus looked at the available evidence and proposed something astonishing. He suggested that the Earth and all the planets revolved around the Sun, and that the Earth itself spun on its axis to create day and night. This was the heliocentric model, a concept we associate with Copernicus in the 16th century. But Copernicus came 1800 years later. We know of Aristarchus's idea only because a later astronomer, Archimedes, mentioned it briefly in a surviving letter. The book where Aristarchus laid out his mathematical proofs, his observations, his full argument for this sun-centered universe, is lost. Imagine that text surviving, copied and studied through the ages. Would the long, confining era of an Earth-centered cosmology, supported by powerful institutions, have been cut short? The intellectual leap was made, but the document that could have carried it forward was extinguished. Then there was Hypatia, often called the greatest astronomer of antiquity. Working in the 2nd century BCE, he compiled the first known comprehensive star catalogue, mapping the positions and brightness of over 1,000 stars with unprecedented precision. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts our view of the stars over a 26,000-year cycle. To make these calculations, he essentially founded the discipline of trigonometry. His work was the bedrock of mathematical astronomy. Later greats like Ptolemy built upon his foundations, often incorporating his data into their own works. But Hypatia's original star catalogue, his personal observations and methods, vanished. Later astronomers had to start from a less complete point, relearning through painstaking observation what had already been meticulously recorded. The delay here is not of a single idea, but of an entire methodology, a dataset that would have served as a fixed point for celestial navigation and discovery for generations. Finally, consider the engineer hero of Alexandria. In the 1st century of the Common Era, he described devices that seemed to leap from the pages of speculative fiction. He built a working steam engine, an aeolipile where jets of steam spun a metal sphere. He created complex automatons, theatrical machines powered by ropes, gears, and compressed air that could open temple doors or enact entire miniature plays. He documented formulas for calculating area and volume, and invented a primitive vending machine. Hero's writings were a treasure trove of applied mechanics. His surviving works are fragments, hints at a mind that viewed the physical world as something to be manipulated and automated. The loss of his complete engineering manuals meant that the concept of harnessing steam for practical work, a principle that would ignite the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, remained a curious toy, a dead end. The collective disappearance of these texts represents more than missing pages. It represents a severed timeline. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was not a sudden burst of light in a dark age. It was in part a rediscovery. Brilliant minds like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton were standing on the shoulders of giants, but they were standing in a library where most of the shelves were empty. They had to reconstruct from scattered fragments and their own genius principles that had already been articulated, proven, and written down. The question is not just what was lost, but how much time was lost with it. Did the absence of Aristarchus's full work add centuries to the dominance of a flawed cosmology? Did the loss of Hypatia's date slow our mapping of the heavens? Without Hero's complete blueprints, was the path to mechanization delayed? The silence that followed the library's end was not merely an absence of sound. It was the quiet of a stalled engine, a pause in a conversation that humanity had only just begun. The most devastating cost of the library's silence can be measured not in plays or planets, but in human lives. For a brief, brilliant moment, medicine in Alexandria stepped out of the shadow of superstition and into the light of direct observation. two physicians, Herophilus and Erasistratus, were granted an unprecedented and deeply controversial privilege by the Ptolemaic rulers: access to human cadavers for systematic dissection. In an age where the inner workings of the body were a mystery explained by philosophy rather than fact, they opened a window. Their hands traced the pathways of nerves, mapped the chambers of the heart, and held the human brain. They were pioneers of empirical science, and their detailed anatomical texts, housed in the library, represented a quantum leap in understanding that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. Herophilus, through meticulous study, made a foundational distinction. He identified the difference between sensory nerves and motor nerves, realizing that some carried signals from the world to the brain, while others carried commands from the brain to the muscles. This was the first clear mapping of the body's internal communication network. He also looked at the brain itself, its grooves and folds, and boldly declared it the seat of human intelligence, the center of thought and feeling, overturning the ancient Aristotelian belief that the heart was the home of the soul. Meanwhile, Erasistratus focused on the cardiovascular system. He described the function of the heart's valves, understanding their role in ensuring blood flowed in one direction. He theorized about the circulation of blood and air, coming closer to the truth of pulmonary function than anyone would again until William Harvey in the 17th century. Their work was not speculative. It was documented evidence, detailed drawings and descriptions based on what they actually saw. But this revolutionary knowledge carried a heavy cultural price. The practice of human dissection, even for science, clashed profoundly with prevailing religious and moral beliefs about the sanctity of the body after death. After the deaths of these two great anatomists, the political and social climate shifted. The practice was banned, their methods were condemned, and their groundbreaking texts were increasingly marginalized, labeled as immoral or impious. When the library faded, these works faded with it. The consequence of this loss was catastrophic and prolonged. Without the empirical foundation laid by Herophilus and Erasistratus, Western medicine drifted back into a world of theory and dogma for centuries. Physicians relied on the writings of Galen, a later Roman doctor whose influential theories were based largely on animal dissections and often contained significant errors that went unchallenged. The brain's true role was forgotten, the circulatory system misunderstood, and treatment became a matter of balancing abstract humors rather than addressing specific, observed pathology. This regression was not merely academic, it had a direct and tragic human toll. For over a millennium, surgeries were performed with a flawed map of the body. Illnesses were misdiagnosed based on theoretical systems. Progress in treating injury and disease stalled, a delay that undoubtedly resulted in incalculable suffering and loss that could have been alleviated. The silence of those lost anatomical scrolls echoes in the centuries of medical darkness that followed, a stark and sobering reminder that when knowledge is suppressed or destroyed, the ultimate price is paid not by ideas but by people. The brain and the body were not the only frontiers mapped within those walls. The library's scholars were also drawing the boundaries of the world itself. Chief among them was Eratosthenes, a man whose mind could grasp the scale of the planet. Serving as the head librarian, he performed a feat of genius using little more than a stick, a well, and a keen understanding of geometry. By measuring the angle of the sun's shadow in two Egyptian cities on the same day, he calculated the Earth's circumference with an error of only a few hundred miles. This astonishingly accurate figure was the cornerstone of his masterwork, a book titled Geographica. It was the first systematic attempt to describe the entire known world, to place every city, mountain, and river on a grid of latitude and longitude. And like so much else from that place, the Geographica is gone. We know its title and its author's fame, but the book itself has vanished. To lose it is to lose the world's first truly scientific atlas. Imagine its pages. It would not have been a single map, but a compendium built from 1,000 sources. The library's agents gathered sailors' logs, caravan ledgers, and the accounts of ambassadors and soldiers. Eratosthenes and his team would have synthesized these fragments, comparing distances, reconciling conflicting reports, and slowly piecing together a coherent image of Europe, North Africa, and Asia. His work likely contained detailed descriptions of coastlines, the courses of major rivers like the Nile and the Indus, the estimated travel times between trading hubs, and theories explaining why climates changed from the equator to the poles. There may even have been speculative charts hinting at lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, based on whispers from Carthaginian explorers or Phoenician traders. This was not just a collection of places, it was an argument for an ordered, measurable cosmos where human habitation could be understood through mathematics and evidence. The loss of such a text and others like it did more than erase a snapshot of ancient geography. It broke a chain of cumulative understanding. When the library faded, that centralized, verified, and ever-improving model of the world shattered into fragments again. Knowledge that had been painstakingly compiled and corrected over generations reverted to rumor, myth, and isolated, often inaccurate, local maps. The cartographic clock was reset. Centuries later, when European sailors of the Age of Discovery set out to cross the oceans, they did so with a geographical understanding that was, in many ways, poorer than what had existed in Alexandria over 1,000 years before. They were not building upon a refined legacy, they were often rediscovering it. They sailed into literal and figurative blank spaces on their charts, spaces that Eratosthenes and his colleagues might have filled with reasoned speculation or even hard data from forgotten voyages. This is the hidden cost of losing a library. It forces every generation to start its exploration from a much closer point to zero. The wheel of discovery must be reinvented, the same coastlines mapped again, the same calculations made anew. Progress becomes not a smooth ascent, but a series of steep climbs followed by precipitous falls into amnesia. The fragile process of consolidating human knowledge, of turning scattered observations into a shared, reliable map, was interrupted for over a millennium. We are left to wonder how many voyages might have been safer, how many cultures connected earlier, had that first great map of the world survived to guide the hands of those who came after. But the library's silence extends beyond the physical world into the very architecture of human thought. Our modern image of ancient philosophy is dominated by two towering figures, Plato and Aristotle. Their works survived not through a single miracle, but through countless copies, painstakingly reproduced across the centuries by scribes in monasteries and academies. They became the canon, the foundation of Western thought. Yet to see them as the entirety of ancient philosophy is to stare at two majestic peaks while ignoring the vast, fertile valley that lay between them. The library at Alexandria held the map to that entire landscape. Within its collection were the complete works of rival schools whose ideas challenged, refined, and offered radical alternatives to the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions. We know their names today: Stoics, Epicureans, Cynics, Skeptics, but our knowledge is like hearing a symphony played only by a single, distant violin. We have fragments, quotes preserved by their critics, and second-hand summaries. The loss of their original, full dialogues means we are often seeing these philosophies through a distorted lens, filtered by the very opponents who sought to discredit them. Imagine trying to understand a political movement today by reading only the attack ads from its rivals. You would get a crude caricature, not the nuanced, living system of beliefs that guided individual lives and shaped societies. The Stoic ideal of virtue through reason and acceptance of fate, the Epicurean pursuit of tranquility through simple pleasures, and the dismissal of supernatural fears, the Cynic's radical rejection of social convention in favor of self-sufficiency, the skeptics' disciplined questioning of all certainties. These were not abstract academic positions. They were comprehensive guides to living, each with its own rich literature of argument, personal reflection, and practical advice. The library held the foundational texts where Zeno laid out Stoicism, where Epicurus composed his letters, where Diogenes crafted his biting critiques of Athenian society. But it also held the works of their lesser-known successors, the philosophers who debated the fine points, who adapted the doctrines to new challenges, who kept these schools vibrant and evolving for centuries. Without these texts, entire branches of the philosophical conversation are severed. We are left with the outlines of their ideas but have lost the texture of the debate, the compelling examples, the personal stories, and the rigorous logic that made them persuasive to millions in the ancient world. This loss has a profound consequence for us today. It narrows our philosophical heritage, presenting the ancient world as a simpler, less contentious place than it truly was. It limits the range of wisdom we can draw upon, offering us a streamlined intellectual history that jumps from Plato to Augustine, while skipping the vibrant marketplace of ideas that flourished in between. The disappearance of these competing voices means we have fewer tools to question our own assumptions, fewer models for different ways of living a good life. The library promised a panorama of human thought, but its ruin left us with a partial portrait where a few celebrated faces are illuminated while a crowd of others remains forever in the shadows, their voices reduced to a faint and fragmented echo. But the fading of the library was not just about scrolls, it was about people. The final, chilling symbol of this end arrived not with a decree, but with a mob in the streets of Alexandria in the year 415. Her name was Hypatia. She was a philosopher, a mathematician, and an astronomer, the head of the Neoplatonic school in the city. To her students, she was a brilliant teacher, continuing the library's legacy of synthesizing knowledge, weaving together geometry, astronomy, and spiritual inquiry into a cohesive view of the universe. She represented the last living link to the open, secular intellectual tradition that the great library had once nurtured and protected. Yet in the tense atmosphere of a city where Christian authority was consolidating power, Hypatia's very existence became a provocation. She was a prominent public intellectual, a woman of immense learning who advised city officials and taught students of all faiths. Her Neoplatonic philosophy, which saw mathematics as a path to divine understanding, was seen by a rising militant faction as dangerous pagan heresy. The conflict was no longer about ideas in a lecture hall. It was about identity and power in the public square. The tragic events that followed were not a random act of violence. They were a targeted political assassination orchestrated by partisans of the Bishop Cyril. Hypatia was seized by a crowd, dragged from her chariot, and subjected to a brutal public attack. Her passing was not just the loss of a single, remarkable individual. It was a message broadcast in the most horrific terms possible to an entire community of thinkers. The message was clear: the old world of pluralistic philosophical inquiry was over. The space for a scholar like Hypatia, a woman who operated freely in the male-dominated public sphere, who taught a spirituality outside the sanctioned creed, had violently closed. In the wake of this trauma, the remaining scholars of her circle fled Alexandria. The conversations stopped, the lectures were silenced. The last guardians of that specific synthesis of science and philosophy, the direct heirs to the library's spirit, were gone. Hypatia's story is often told as a singular tragedy, a poignant tale of a martyr for knowledge, and it is that. But in the context of the library's long decline, it represents something even more systemic. It marks the moment when the conflict between faith and reason, between dogmatic authority and free inquiry, tipped decisively toward suppression. The great library's physical structure may have still been standing in some form, but with Hypatia's death, its soul was extinguished. The vibrant, dangerous, and essential conversation that had defined Alexandria for centuries was now too perilous to host. The light did not just fade. It was deliberately and publicly snuffed out. The vibrant, global conversation of Alexandria did not end with a whisper, but with a resounding silence that settled over Europe for centuries. In the absence of that central, encyclopedic library, the very structure of knowledge itself shattered. There was no longer one great repository where a scholar could consult the original works of Aristotle alongside Babylonian star charts and Egyptian medical texts. Instead, learning retreated into 1,000 isolated cells. The torch of preservation passed to monastic scriptoria, quiet rooms where monks meticulously copied texts by candlelight. Their work was heroic, a lifeline through a turbulent age, but it came with an unavoidable consequence. Each monastery's library reflected its own limited collection, its own theological priorities, and the fragile chain of whatever manuscripts had managed to find their way to its doors. Knowledge became geographically fragmented and incredibly vulnerable. A fire in one monastery could erase the only copy of a classical work for an entire region, a loss from which there was no recovery. This was a world without backups, where the survival of an idea depended on the luck of geography and the interests of a single abbot. The content of these salvaged libraries was itself a narrowing of the ancient world's intellectual horizon. What survived was not the rich, contradictory, and empirical original texts from Alexandria, but a filtered version. Often, monks copied not Plato's full dialogues, but summaries written by later commentators. They preserved the works of the Church Fathers and approved Latin authors like Cicero, but the revolutionary scientific and philosophical tracts from the Greek world were largely absent or existed only in fragmented, second-hand quotations. Scholars of this new era, known as the medieval period, were not working with the raw data of the ancients. They were working with digests, with interpretations, with a canon that had already been curated by centuries of religious and cultural selection. This created an intellectual environment focused on commentary and authority. The great project of medieval thought, scholasticism, was built on this foundation. Its method was one of intense logical debate, but the goal was not to discover new facts about the natural world through observation. The goal was to reconcile and systematize the knowledge already contained within the accepted authorities, primarily the Bible and the works of a few sanctioned philosophers like Aristotle, as he was understood through later lenses. This shift represents a profound change in the purpose of learning. The Alexandrian model was outward-looking, integrative, and driven by empirical curiosity. It sought to add to the world's knowledge by studying the world itself. The medieval model, by necessity born of loss, became inward-looking, deductive, and focused on preserving and clarifying a received tradition. It was a brilliant intellectual edifice built within a walled garden. The garden was beautiful and orderly, but its borders were fixed. The vast forests of global knowledge that once lay beyond its walls, the Indian mathematics, the Persian astronomy, the full scope of Greek medicine and pre-Socratic philosophy, were now just legends, forgotten maps to territories that had sunk beneath the sea of time. This is the silent legacy of the library's fall. It did not cause the so-called Dark Ages, a term historians now use with great caution, but it directly shaped the intellectual conditions of early medieval Europe. The loss forced a great reset. The integrated, scientific, and global knowledge of Alexandria was replaced by a more insular, text-centered, and theologically framed tradition. For a long season, the human mind turned inward, mastering the logic of the texts it had, while the immense, challenging, and liberating expanse of what it had lost waited in darkness. The question that lingers is not about the darkness itself, but about the length of the night and how many dawns were delayed because the great lighthouse of knowledge had gone dark. Yet the story does not end in total darkness. Even as the great collection in Alexandria crumbled into silence, other hands were already at work, carefully copying the light onto new pages. Far to the east, in the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, a different kind of preservation was underway. Here, Greek was still the language of state and church. In monasteries and imperial libraries, scribes labored over parchment, not papyrus, meticulously transcribing the works of Plato, Aristotle, and the Greek historians. Their mission was not the universal ambition of the Ptolemies. It was a more focused act of cultural conservation, ensuring the survival of their own Hellenic heritage through an age of immense upheaval. These Byzantine copies, often the only versions to survive into the modern era, became the fragile vessels carrying classical thought across a wide and turbulent sea of time. But this channel, while vital, was also a narrow one. The selection was shaped by Byzantine religious and scholarly priorities, preserving philosophy and theology, while many scientific and technical works slipped through the cracks, deemed less essential for the curriculum of the age. A far more transformative revival was brewing in a new center of power. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad launched one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in history. They established the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was not merely a library, but a vibrant institute of translation and research that consciously echoed the lost spirit of Alexandria. Caliphs like Al-Mamun actively sponsored scholars Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian with a single directive: find the surviving ancient texts wherever they may be and translate them into Arabic. Agents were sent across the known world, to Byzantine monasteries, to Persian archives, to Indian centers of learning, bartering for manuscripts. In Baghdad's workshops, teams of linguists and scholars pored over these recovered treasures. The works of Aristotle, Ptolemy's Almagest, the medical encyclopedias of Galen, and the geometry of Euclid were translated, studied, debated, and annotated. Crucially, they also translated Persian texts on administration and Indian works on mathematics, including the revolutionary concept of zero. This was not passive preservation. It was active digestion and advancement. Scholars in the Islamic Golden Age did not just copy these works. They questioned them, corrected them, and built upon them. The astronomer al-Battani refined Ptolemy's models. The physician al-Razi expanded upon Galen's medicine with his own clinical observations. The mathematician al-Khwarizmi systematized algebra, a word derived from his own work. The torch of learning had not merely been passed, it had been refueled and carried forward on a new path. This narrative provides a crucial and hopeful counterpoint. It shows that human curiosity is a resilient flame. While the Library of Alexandria's unique and comprehensive archive was irreplaceable, the seeds of its knowledge had already been scattered by the wind. Some took root in the scriptoria of Constantinople. Others found fertile ground in the scholarly courtyards of Baghdad, where they blossomed into new forms and fueled centuries of innovation that would, in time, help rekindle learning in Europe itself. The loss was profound, but it was not absolute. The great conversation was interrupted, its volume turned down to a whisper for centuries, but the most persistent threads of the dialogue were picked up by new voices in new languages, ensuring that the light, though diminished, would never fully go out. Even vanished books can cast long, haunting shadows. The complete texts from Alexandria are gone, but they left faint imprints on the works that did survive, like ghostly fingerprints on the windows of history. This is the world of the ghost reference, a tantalizing clue embedded in a later author's writing that points directly to a source we can no longer hold. To understand this, think of a modern scholar writing a research paper. They cite their sources, quoting and paraphrasing the works they used. Now, imagine 1,000 years from now, only that scholar's paper survives, while every single book they cited has been destroyed. You would be left with a collection of brilliant ideas that clearly aren't original, attributed to authors and texts that are now just names. You would have the echo, but not the voice that made the original sound. This is precisely the situation we face with the library. Later Roman encyclopedists and engineers, men like Vitruvius in architecture and Pliny the Elder in natural history, almost certainly had access to Alexandrian collections. Their surviving works are littered with these ghostly citations. Pliny, in his monumental Natural History, frequently prefaces a fact with phrases like, as recorded by the ancient authorities, or according to the lost books of the Chaldeans. He is handing us a map to a treasure that has already been looted, pointing to shelves in the great library that are now empty. Through these scattered references, scholars perform a kind of intellectual archaeology. They sift through the surviving text, collecting every quote, every paraphrase, every offhand mention of a lost author or title. By carefully assembling these fragments, they can sometimes reconstruct the rough outline of a vanished work, like deducing the shape of a dinosaur from a few fossilized bones. For instance, multiple later authors describe astonishing automata from Alexandria, mechanical birds that sang, statues that poured wine, even a miniature automated theater. These descriptions are vivid, but they lack the technical blueprints. Those blueprints, the works of engineers like Hero of Alexandria, were almost certainly in the library. The ghost references tell us these marvels existed and hint at their complexity, but the manual for building them is lost. Similarly, astronomical commentaries from the medieval Islamic world or Byzantium will often mention an observation or a theory attributed to Hypatia or Aristarchus that doesn't appear in any surviving text. These are the echoes of their lost star catalogues and heliocentric models, captured in the writings of admirers centuries later. Each ghost reference is a small victory and a profound frustration. It confirms that a specific piece of knowledge once lived, that a particular scroll once rested on a particular shelf. It proves the library's pervasive influence, showing how its contents radiated outwards to shape scholarship across the Mediterranean world for generations. Yet these echoes also deepen the mystery. They are the scattered pieces of a shattered mosaic, allowing us to guess at the grand image, but forever denying us the chance to see it whole. This detective work ensures the library is never truly silent. In every footnote of a surviving ancient book, in every borrowed idea in a medieval treatise, we hear its faint, persistent whisper. The whispers of those ghost references lead us to an irresistible, almost painful question. Could any physical piece of the library itself still exist, waiting in some forgotten corner to be read once more? The rational answer is a sobering no. The odds are astronomically small. Papyrus and parchment are fragile, and the fires, decay, and repurposing of 2 millennia are formidable enemies. Yet the human impulse to search, to hope, is undimmed. This modern quest is not a wild treasure hunt, but a disciplined exploration of tantalizing possibilities, a scientific effort to listen for the faintest echo in the archaeological record. One persistent theory suggests that as the main library complex became unstable, custodians may have undertaken a desperate, secretive salvage operation. Portions of the most prized collections could have been moved to safer repositories. The Serapeum temple, before its own destruction, is a prime candidate. Other scrolls might have found their way into the private libraries of wealthy villas in Alexandria, or even been shipped to other centers of learning, their origins forgotten as they were absorbed into new collections. These scrolls wouldn't be labeled as property of the great library. They would simply be ancient texts, their provenance blurred by time. This means that any papyrus discovered in the region from the correct era could, in theory, be a refugee from that grand collection, its true home forever unknown. Another haunting possibility involves a grim form of recycling. In ancient Egypt, a common material for creating mummy casings called cartonnage was made from layers of old papyrus glued together. Scholars have recovered such cartonnage, painstakingly peeled apart the layers, and found them to be recycled documents, tax records, personal letters, and literary fragments. It is a chilling thought that pages from plays by Sophocles or theorems by Euclid could have been pulped and molded into the funeral mask for a wealthy citizen, their wisdom literally forming the face presented to the gods. While no identifiable library scroll has been found this way, the practice reminds us that knowledge, when no longer valued as knowledge, becomes mere raw material. The most tangible reason for hope today comes not from Egypt but from Italy. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD buried the town of Herculaneum, carbonizing an entire villa's library of papyrus scrolls into blackened, brittle lumps. For centuries, they were considered unreadable, as fragile as charcoal. But modern technology has performed a kind of miracle. Using a technique called multispectral imaging, scientists can now scan these scrolls with different wavelengths of light. The subtle variations in how the carbonized ink reflects this light allow sophisticated software to detect the letters, making the text visible without ever unrolling the fragile artifact. This breakthrough is revolutionary. It proves that texts thought forever lost to physical damage can, under extraordinary conditions, speak again. It fuels the dream that somewhere in the soil of Alexandria, in a sealed cellar or a collapsed sewer, a similar cache of scrolls carbonized by one of the city's many fires and preserved by the dry climate might lie waiting. The search is now driven by this sophisticated technological prowess, a marriage of satellite archaeology, ground-penetrating radar, and patient excavation. The quest may never yield a scroll stamped with the seal of the Mausian, but the enduring hope itself is a powerful legacy. It connects our 21st century tools directly to the recovery of ancient thought, creating a poignant bridge across the silence. We are not just looking for scraps of papyrus. We are looking for a chance, however slim, to end the sentence that was cut off 2,000 years ago, to turn an echo back into a voice. Our own age is constructing a library of staggering ambition, one that makes the Ptolemy's dream seem modest. We call it the Internet, a digital Alexandria of instant access, where the collected works of humanity are just a search away. This vast cloud holds our art, our science, our history, and the mundane records of daily life. It promises permanence, a world where nothing is ever truly forgotten. Yet this promise is an illusion, a fragile one built on a foundation we barely understand. We are centralizing the knowledge of our species once again, but into server farms instead of stone halls, creating a new single point of catastrophic failure. The parallels are not just poetic, they are a stark and urgent warning. We are repeating the architectural flaw of Alexandria on a planetary scale, and we have added new, digital forms of decay that the ancient librarians could never have envisioned. Consider the silent, creeping threats. Papyrus crumbled from humidity and neglect. Our digital texts face a similar, invisible rot called format obsolescence. A document saved on a floppy disk just 30 years ago is now often unreadable, not because the plastic degraded, but because the software and hardware to interpret its magnetic patterns no longer exist. The file is there, a perfect sequence of ones and zeros, but it is locked in a language no modern machine speaks. This is digital entropy, a loss not from deletion, but from technological evolution leaving data behind. Then there is the fragility of the corporations that host our modern knowledge. Countless personal blogs, photo archives, and niche forums have vanished not from a global cataclysm, but from a simple business decision, a failed startup, a discontinued service, a change in terms of use. When a social media platform shuts down, it takes with it the conversations, the family histories, the cultural snapshots stored there. This is loss by spreadsheet, a quiet erosion as real as any worm eating through parchment. But the threats are not only slow, they can be devastatingly fast. The the Great Library faced fire from civil war, our digital repository faces a constant barrage of cyber attacks, deliberate acts of erasure or ransom that can wipe entire databases in moments. A single sophisticated breach could corrupt financial records, delete scientific datasets, or deface cultural archives, and beyond human malice lies a cosmic vulnerability. A powerful solar flare, a coronal mass ejection, could send an electromagnetic pulse toward Earth, frying the delicate circuitry of satellites and power grids. Such an event would not just cause a blackout, it could physically destroy the hard drives in data centers, melting the very infrastructure of our global memory. In an instant, we could be thrust back into a pre-digital age, with no way to recover the knowledge we so carelessly entrusted to machines. This modern context forces us to see the story of Alexandria not as a distant tragedy, but as a live case study. It asks us bluntly, have we learned anything? We know the cost of centralizing knowledge in one physical location. Yet we have enthusiastically built a system where our global cultural record depends on a handful of corporate giants and their server clusters, often located in geographically risky areas. We know the danger of political and ideological shifts, of powerful entities deciding which knowledge is valid or worthy of preservation. We see this playing out today in debates over digital censorship, algorithmic bias, and the rewriting of online history. The library's guardians chose what to collect and copy, shaping the narrative for posterity. Our digital gatekeepers, search engines and platform algorithms, perform a similar curation, deciding what information is seen, what is amplified, and what is buried in obscurity. The mechanism is different, but the power to shape collective memory is eerily familiar. So how do we preserve the light of our own era? The lesson of Alexandria is not to abandon the project of gathering knowledge. It is to build in redundancy, in decentralization, and in formats meant to last. It means supporting physical archives alongside digital ones, etching important data onto stable media like archival-grade optical discs, or even, in experimental projects, encoding DNA with information. It means open source standards and regular, widespread migration of data to new formats before the old ones die. It means recognizing that preservation is not a one-time act, but a continuous, active duty, a covenant we make with the future. The silence that followed Alexandria was a choice made by neglect, by a society that stopped valuing the maintenance of its memory. We are making choices every day about what to save, what to back up, and what to let fade. The question hanging over our digital age is whether we are building a library for the ages, or merely a magnificent, vulnerable sandcastle waiting for the next tide. The ambition to gather all knowledge is not an innocent one. Behind the noble goal of preservation lies a fundamental tension, a question that the library's history forces into the light. Who truly has the right to collect, to curate, and to control the story of humanity? The Ptolemies, Greek rulers of Egypt, answered with sheer power. Their campaign of acquisition, seizing texts from ships and forfeiting silver to keep Athenian treasures, was a form of cultural imperialism. They centralized the intellectual wealth of the Mediterranean world under their own roof, defining what constituted valuable knowledge through the lens of their own royal project. A universal archive in their hands was also an instrument of soft power, a way to legitimize their rule by positioning their capital as the undeniable center of the civilized world. This act of gathering, however well-intentioned, carried an implicit judgment. It declared that these scattered works were safer, more meaningful, and better understood when removed from their original contexts and placed under one administrative gaze. The library became a monument not just to knowledge but to the authority that claimed to be its ultimate guardian. This dynamic did not end with the Ptolemies. The later attacks on the library and its annexes, particularly the destruction of the Serapeum, flipped the script but operated on the same principle of control. Where the Ptolemies collected to build prestige, later authorities destroyed to enforce orthodoxy. Texts were deemed heretical, obsolete, or dangerous not because of their content, but because they challenged a newly dominant worldview. The loss of philosophical and scientific works in that era was a catastrophic act of ideological curation, a decision that certain branches of human thought were not worth saving and should be actively erased. This is the stark politics of preservation. At every stage, from aggressive collection to targeted destruction, powerful institutions made choices. They decided what was valuable, what was acceptable, and what was a threat. The library story shows that the archive is never neutral. It is always a reflection of the values, fears, and ambitions of those who build it and those who seek to tear it down. These are not relics of ancient history. We grapple with their echoes every day. Modern debates over digital archives and open access revolve around the same core issues. Who decides what data is saved for the future when server space is finite? Which languages and perspectives are prioritized by search algorithms, effectively curating our global digital library? The push for cultural repatriation, for returning artifacts and human remains to their communities of origin, is a direct challenge to the Ptolemaic model. It asks whether a universal museum, however noble its educational mission, has the right to hold the cultural heritage of others, often acquired under colonial power. The ethical dimension is inescapable. Is a single, centralized repository a beacon of shared human heritage, or is it a form of gatekeeping that inevitably distorts the narrative? The Library of Alexandria, in both its creation and its ruin, presents this dilemma in its rawest form. It challenges us to build systems of memory that are not only durable, but also just, inclusive, and transparent about the power they wield. For in the end, the story we save is the story we choose to tell about ourselves. The library's story persists because it is no longer just history. It has become a modern myth, a powerful symbol that outlived its own physical reality. Its power lies in its ambiguity, the very fact that we cannot pinpoint a single moment or villain for its end. This unresolved mystery makes it a perfect vessel, a blank page onto which every generation inscribes its own deepest fears and hopes about knowledge itself. For some, it represents a stolen golden age, a time when humanity supposedly held all wisdom in one place before a fall into darkness. It becomes a nostalgic parable about a more enlightened past, a reminder of what we have lost. This view often carries a subtle warning, a fear that our own civilization is just as fragile, that our own storehouses of learning could vanish in an instant of conflict or neglect. The library becomes the ultimate cautionary tale about the thin veneer of civilization. Yet the myth also fuels a more optimistic narrative, one of an eternal struggle between the forces of light and shadow. In this telling, the library is a beacon of pure reason besieged by the armies of ignorance, whether those armies are Roman generals, religious zealots, or indifferent bureaucrats. It frames the loss as a heroic, tragic battle in an ongoing war for the human mind, a war that continues today in debates over censorship, education, and access to information. This duality is the source of its enduring resonance. The library is both a monument to our highest aspirations and a grave marker for our worst failures. Its story allows us to mourn the universal while searching for a specific culprit, to grieve for an abstract ideal of lost wisdom while imagining the exact scrolls that turn to ash. We use it to process our own complex relationship with knowledge in the digital age, a time of both unprecedented access and alarming vulnerability. The myth endures because it asks a timeless question that every society must answer for itself. What are we willing to sacrifice to protect the light of understanding, and what are the consequences when we let that light go out? In the library's silent halls, we find not just the ghost of ancient scholars, but a mirror reflecting our own choices about what we value, what we save, and what we are prepared to lose. The silent fate of Alexandria offers us a stark and practical blueprint, not for what to build, but for how to protect what we value. Its primary lesson is one of architecture. Do not construct a single, magnificent vault for all your treasures. The library's greatest vulnerability was its own grandeur, its centralization. When knowledge is concentrated in one place, it becomes a singular target for accident, conflict, or ideological purge. The antidote is decentralization. This means actively supporting a diverse ecosystem of memory. The local public library digitizing town archives, the university preserving rare manuscripts, the open source community backing up code on independent servers across the globe. A healthy civilization does not have one great library. It has 10,000 of them, each holding unique pieces of the puzzle, ensuring that no single disaster can erase the whole picture. This principle moves preservation from a passive act of storage to an active strategy of distribution. Redundancy is the companion to decentralization. The Ptolemies collected originals, but they also understood the power of the copy. Their scribes worked tirelessly to duplicate texts, yet they kept most copies under one roof. True redundancy requires copies to travel, to cross borders and languages. The survival of Greek philosophy owes less to Alexandria and more to the Byzantine monks who copied it in Constantinople and the Arab scholars who translated it in Baghdad. Each act of translation and transcription created a new lifeline, a new thread in the safety net. In our digital age, redundancy isn't just about more copies on more hard drives. It is about format diversity, maintaining physical books alongside digital files, etching crucial data onto archival-grade media, and regularly migrating information forward before the software needed to read it becomes obsolete. Knowledge must be nomadic, able to move and adapt, or it risks becoming a prisoner in a dying format. Finally, preservation demands continuous, conscious curation. A library is not a time capsule sealed and forgotten. It is a living garden that requires constant tending. Scrolls in Alexandria decayed when they were neglected. In our world, digital links break, file formats expire, and platforms vanish overnight. The work of preservation is never finished. It is the ongoing duty of migrating knowledge to new mediums, of verifying data integrity, and of making conscious choices about what to carry forward. This requires resources, vigilance, and most importantly, a broad cultural consensus that the past is worth the investment. It asks us to value librarians, archivists, and data stewards as the guardians of our collective memory. The fall of Alexandria did not happen in a day. It was the culmination of a long series of choices to deprioritize, to defund, and to look away. The greatest threat to any library is not the flame, but the belief that someone else will always keep the fire watch. Our lesson is clear. We must build distributed, redundant, and actively tended networks of memory. For the conversation of humanity must never again depend on the survival of a single, silent room. These questions linger because they are ultimately unanswerable, and that is precisely what makes them so powerful. We can trace the outlines of lost plays and map the shadows of vanished star charts, but the true cost of the library's silence exists in a realm we can never fully enter, the world of what might have been. This is the territory of historical imagination, a place where we must tread carefully, guided not by fantasy, but by the logical consequences of what we know was lost. If the continuous thread of inquiry woven in Alexandria had remained unbroken, how different might our intellectual journey look? Consider the timeline of discovery. The revolutionary idea of a sun-centered solar system, proposed by Aristotle in the 3rd century before the Common Era, was a spark that flickered and died. It took the Western world until the 16th century to rekindle that same flame with Copernicus. That is a gap of roughly 1800 years. If Aristarchus's full treatise, backed by the authority of the Great Library, had been copied, taught, and debated across generations, would that concept have slowly gained traction? Could the long detour of an Earth-centered universe, which shaped everything from cosmology to theology, have been shortened by centuries? The delay represents more than just a wrong idea lingering. It represents a fundamental constraint on how humanity saw its place in the cosmos, a limitation that influenced art, philosophy, and the very boundaries of thought. The loss in medicine is even more stark in its human dimension. The empirical, hands-on knowledge of Herophilus and Erasistratus, their maps of nerves and theories of circulation, vanished. Medicine regressed to a system of abstract humors for over a millennium. Without that setback, how many lives might have been saved by more accurate surgeries, by earlier understandings of anatomy and contagion? The path to germ theory or advanced surgical technique might have begun not in the 19th century but in the first. Each generation of healers would have built upon a solid foundation of observed fact, not struggled to relearn it. The cumulative effect is almost beyond comprehension. It suggests we might not speak of a single renaissance in the 15th century, but of several waves of enlightenment, each building directly on the last without a prolonged season of fragmentation and recovery. The so-called Dark Ages were not an empty void, but they were a period where the integrated, scientific, and global knowledge of the ancient world was no longer the common inheritance of scholars. Its absence forced a reset, a return to first principles that consumed precious centuries. Asking these speculative questions is not an exercise in nostalgic grief. It serves a vital purpose in the present. It forces us to confront the non-linear nature of progress. Human understanding does not march inevitably forward. It can plateau, it can circle back on itself, and it can, as the library's story proves, lose ground. Every major breakthrough in our history rests upon a fragile chain of transmission, a series of copies, translations, and teachers passing a fragile flame from one hand to the next. The library's fate demonstrates with brutal clarity how easily that chain can be severed. When we look at our own digital age, with its own centralized vulnerabilities and new forms of decay, these unanswerable questions become an urgent warning. They challenge us to be the guardians our ancestors sometimes failed to be. They ask us to look at the knowledge we possess today, not as a permanent possession, but as a temporary loan to our era, a flame we are responsible for passing forward, brighter and stronger, to those who will come after us. The legacy of Alexandria is not merely a catalogue of what was lost. It is a perpetual reminder that the light of understanding is never guaranteed. It must be tended, defended, and generously shared, for its opposite is not darkness, but a silence so deep we may never know what wonders it has swallowed. That scar on human understanding is also a map. It traces the vulnerable points in our own systems, the places where the light can still go out. The story of the Secret Library is not a closed book from a distant past. It is an open manual for the present. It shows us that the greatest threats are rarely a single dramatic fire. They are the slow creep of neglect, the shifting winds of ideology, and the dangerous allure of centralizing our most precious thoughts in one fragile place. We have inherited both the ambition of the Ptolemies and the consequences of their failure. Our digital world now mirrors that ancient ambition on a planetary scale, gathering the sum of human knowledge into vast, invisible server farms. Yet we face the same core vulnerabilities, amplified by new and complex forms of decay. The silence that followed Alexandria was a choice, made over generations, to stop valuing the maintenance of memory. We are making similar choices every single day, often without even realizing it. what we choose to back up, what formats we preserve, which stories we elevate, and which we allow to fade into broken links. These are the modern equivalents of a scribe deciding which scroll to copy as the funds run out. This narrative compels us to look at our own role. Are we passive consumers of information or active guardians of the conversation? The library's fate teaches that preservation is not a spectator sport. It requires intention, resources, and a broad cultural commitment to seeing knowledge as a common trust, not a disposable commodity. It asks us to support the librarians, the archivists, the open-source developers, and the local historians, the modern scribes who keep the channels of memory open. Their work is the quiet, essential antidote to the great silence. So let this story be more than a lament for lost wonders. Let it be a spark for vigilance. Look at the digital platforms you use, the family photos stored in a single cloud account, the unique community history known only to a few elders. Ask yourself, what is my piece of this vast, fragile library? How can I help ensure its light reaches the future? The quest that began in Alexandria never truly ended. It simply passed to us. We are now the custodians, standing in the long shadow of that silent hall, holding a flickering torch. The question is whether we will tend its flame or, through inattention, let the wind take it once more. If this journey through history's greatest lost wisdom resonated with you, consider subscribing for more explorations into the mysteries that shape our world. And we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us, if you could recover one single piece of lost knowledge from the ashes of time, what would you choose to bring back into the light?